Right, so here is today's little homily. Why has the US dollar not collapsed already? This may seem like a silly question, but there are an awful lot of people, and some of them very knowledgeable people, some of them who've been involved with the Treasury all their lives, and some of them who've actually been presidential advisors, who have stated that they thought it would have disintegrated long ago, years ago, months ago. Well, it would seem that there are two basic reasons. And the first reason is bad or false accounting. Now, the first example of this really is GDP and all these revisions. Now, many economists just say this is rubbish because if you don't know what your GDP is, then really the entire accounting network of the country, as designed by the US federal government, really is no good whatsoever. Now, what is really suspicious about this is, you remember the really appalling GDP there was for the first quarter that got blamed on, oh gosh, it's the weather. And people weren't going out and shopping because they were shivering around indoors, and companies couldn't do certain things because of the weather, and so on and so forth. Well, the weather happens every year for a kick-off. And the other thing is the figures were revised upwards, if you remember. At around about the same time, the figures for GDP in the second quarter were revised downwards. By about the same amount too. Now, the thing is, you can imagine that there was some carryover. That if people didn't go out and buy in quarter one, they went out and bought in quarter two, and they bought more. So the government just took some of that money and posted it backwards into the first quarter to make things look a bit better, to say, hey, we're nowhere near a recession, are we? And then the latest GDP is comparatively astronomical, unless you take the employment figures into account, in which case it's awful. And that brings to employment. I mean, there are now so many people that aren't counted using this new American system that it's ridiculous. I mean, they're saying, oh, unemployment is running at 12 to 13%, whereas in actual fact, if you count all the people that they think aren't looking for work, and I can guarantee you that they are, most of them, they just can't find a damn job, then the unemployment rate is nearly 25%. So the citizens are bamboozled, and the citizens are not actually reacting to this the way they should be. And foreign investors look at this and they think, well, you know, if things were bad in my country, we'd have riots. If things were bad in my country, there'd be calls for the government to step down. If things were that bad in my country, people would be imprisoned. And so the foreign investors are also bamboozled. And the US government effectively is getting away with saying it's a boom. Well, no, it's not a boom. Look around you. If you live in the States, does it feel like a boom to you? Detroit's bankrupt. It's just lost its power grid, the municipal power grid. How many people do you know that can't find a job? Look around you at all the shops that have closed, at all the businesses that have closed, at all the houses that have been foreclosed and people no longer live in them, and at the anger of those people and ask yourself, does this look like a boom? Because that is what the government's figures are reporting. And this is all helping to prop up the dollar. And believe you me, the longer the dollar stays propped up, the worse the eventual collapse is going to be. Now recently there's been a lot of fuss, and you can look at a video that I've done on it about the American gold reserves having gone. There's a lot of people that think there is no gold now in America. Well, or not very much, apart from the tiny amount that's declared on COMEX. You know, like 300 tons or so out of the 8,100 or so that the US is supposed to have. Now, there are some suspicions here, and I'm going to give you a disclaimer. This is my opinion, okay? But my opinion is reasonably reliable. In my last gold video, I talked about the fact that Asian gold is a lot more expensive for physical gold than for paper. A lot more expensive. And I was talking maybe a third higher. And lo and behold, a couple of weeks later on Greg Hunter, a gentleman comes on and he makes the statement that gold in Asia, if you buy it in ton quantities, is around about $1,600 to $1,800 an ounce, not 1,100 as it was at the time when he said that, although gold has since bounced up back to 1,200. So sometimes I do know what I'm talking about, and what I suspect has been happening is that the Treasury bonds that the US sold to China, which are how the debt system works. I mean, basically in order to print money, the US has to sell something to somebody else, and the favourite thing to sell is Treasury bonds, and these mature after 10 years, 30 years, whatever the figure on the bond says, and at that point the US has to pay the money back. And you can imagine this has been going on for a long time. So Treasury bonds are coming up for renewal now on a yearly basis. So how has the United States been paying it back? If I was China and I looked at the economic figures and I looked at everything else, well, would I take dollars again? Would I say, oh, that's fine, you've just got a Treasury bond that's matured for say $1 trillion, and the United States comes along and says, okay, well, we'll pay you with 2 more Treasury bonds, and it's going to be a $1 trillion Treasury bond and a $100 million Treasury bond, or whatever. Would you take that? Bearing in mind that the United States no longer produces very much. I mean, the Chinese are trying to spend their dollars like crazy at the moment. They're buying hotels, they're buying real estate, they're buying all sorts of businesses in the US to try and sink the number of dollars that they have. No, I wouldn't take it. I'd say to the US government, look, we won't tell anyone about it, but you pay us in something hard. You pay us in gold. You pay us in silver, because China uses a shed load of silver in its electronics industry. And I believe myself this is what has been happening, and that this is what has been keeping the dollar afloat, and this is going to go on until the US has no assets that China want. At that point, China will simply stop. The US is going to have to default on treasuries, because China is not going to accept anything else. They're not going to accept fiat currency for the treasuries. And then what's going to happen? Who knows? Who knows? But a major default would then put America's credit rating if it weren't for the fact that it's American companies that issue the credit rating, straight into the skip. And with no money coming in, and 18 or 19 trillion dollars by then of debt, then there's only one way things can go, and it won't be very pleasant. It would have been much better to sort this out when there was only 7 or 8 trillion dollars worth of debt a few years ago. Much better. But, you know, politicians, they won't grasp the nettle. They want to get re-elected. They want to get their fortune out of it. They don't really care about you guys. So, I hope you found this informative, and I hope you found it useful. If you have, please like and subscribe. And I'm going to tack a bit more video on the end of it, just for fun. Thank you very much. Bye.
Case, if you get away from just the what was there a mistake in what they did, the broader point being we've just gone through a period where members of the U.S. government were standing up in public and saying maybe it would be okay if the U.S. government defaulted on some of its obligations. That's a deeply unsettling moment.
The indication that people are expecting deflation? Are they wrong-headed?
Well, that's because the United States government, Mr. Bernanke, is over there with his printing presses. You know, the central bank now buys over 70% of the government bonds in America. Now, if you'd said that 5 years ago or 10 years ago, people would have thought you were totally nuts. It could not happen in America. Now it's happening, of course. If you give me that kind of printing press, I could drive bonds straight through the roof, and that's what Mr. Bernanke's doing. By the way, for full disclosure, I'm short bonds at the moment. I shorted them a month or two ago. But no, listen, I've shorted them 2 or 3 times and been wrong. So don't think just because I'm short bonds, they're going to go down. But I am short bonds as we speak.
But that means you think that other people are going to think they're going to go down, because I've heard you say it's not about what you expect, it's what you expect everybody else to expect too, right?
Well, yeah, of course, that's the way the markets work. Yes, we will see. I am short bonds at the moment.
All right.
I don't know how much longer this bond. I don't know how much Mr. Bernanke can run his printing presses.
Or what will happen if he's not?
Most of the banks in the world today are insolvent. Most governments of the world today are bankrupt. And again, that goes to where the bubble is. You know, we think the U.S. government debt is a safe haven. It's not safe. The Scottish historian Neil Ferguson has a wonderful quote. He said that government bonds are a safe haven like Pearl Harbor was a safe haven in 1941. It's not.
Hi, I'm Donna Reed. I'd like to talk to you about a unique Christmas gift. A gift that will fit any situation, is always in the best of taste, and will never go out of style. One guess. You're right, it's money. But not the ordinary kind of money. No, this is growing money. Would you like to see some? U.S. savings bonds. Now, watch how they grow. We'll put one $50 bond, which costs you only $37.50, and take it for a ride through time. Starting right here, December 1961. Here's December 1964, and look, that $37.50 has already grown to $41.32. Now we're pulling into August 1968, and that $37.50 has grown to a full $50. And it's still going, still growing. And savings bonds will keep on growing as long as you keep them.